What would you do if the love of your life was gone and the house you built together became her tomb for years? Edward Whitmore, a reclusive millionaire perched high on Windmere Cliff, lived surrounded by silence. The Atlantic crashed below, the gardens wilted, and every echo in the halls whispered the same name, Eleanor. He had money, but no meaning, breath, but no life. Until the day a young secretary named Clara Dawson walked through his door and refused to be afraid of his ghosts. What happens when grief meets courage, when guilt begins to thaw into hope, and when the man who once swore he'd never love again finds his heart beating for someone new, someone who teaches him that healing isn't forgetting, it's remembering differently. But as the past resurfaces, dark secrets threaten to destroy the fragile peace they've built. Will Edward find redemption? Or will jealousy once again cost him everything he loves? This is a story of loss, forgiveness, and the quiet, stubborn grace of second chances. If you believe that hearts can heal and love can begin again, please like, share, and subscribe, because what you're about to hear might just remind you that even after the storm, the light always returns. The wind never truly stopped at Windmere Cliff. It howled through the old chimneys like a restless soul, carrying the scent of salt and pine through the vast, echoing halls of the Whitmore estate. The mansion stood like a forgotten ship above the Atlantic elegant, wounded and silent. Inside, the air felt heavy with memory. Dust lay across the marble banisters like a thin gray veil, softening what had once gleamed with life. The skylights that crowned the main hall filtered the afternoon sun in fractured beams, as if even the light had grown cautious of entering. Somewhere, faintly, lingered the trace of Eleanor's perfumed jasmine and cedar haunting the corners of rooms that hadn't seen her smile in nearly 3 years. Edward Whitmore moved through these rooms as if he were their ghost. Every morning began the same, 6:30, black coffee, 2 pieces of dry toast, no music, no radio. He'd sit at the oak desk in his study, reviewing architectural proposals that no longer stirred him. Once, he had built cities in miniature towers of glass and light. Now, he only approved other people's dreams. At precisely noon, Margaret Hill, his longtime housekeeper, would bring him lunch soup or sandwiches, depending on what she could coax him to eat. She had learned not to speak unless spoken to. Edward's replies were polite, sparse. Then, at 8 p.m., the ritual concluded 1 glass of single malt whiskey by the fireplace, always poured into Eleanor's favorite crystal tumbler. He would stare at the flames, thinking how they devoured everything they touched and left nothing but heat and memory. How can a house be so full, he thought once, tracing the rim of the glass with his thumb, and still feel like a tomb? The question hung in the stillness. The grandfather clock answered only with its tired ticking. On this particular afternoon, the ocean was restless. The waves struck the cliffs with a violence that made the windows shudder. Edward stood by the tall French doors, watching the gray horizon blur into mist. His reflection stared back at him tall, still broad-shouldered, but aged beyond his 52 years. Silver streaked his dark hair, and his blue eyes had lost their sharpness. He thought of Eleanor, of how she used to press her face to the same glass, laughing when the wind tossed her hair like sea foam. "One day the ocean will take this house," she'd said once, smiling. Maybe it already has. Edward turned away. The ache never lessened. It only learned to hide. Behind him came the soft, familiar sound of Margaret clearing her throat. She never simply entered. She announced herself, giving him the option to send her away. "Sir," she began gently, her voice a blend of respect and quiet concern. "I've been meaning to speak with you about the office." He didn't turn around. "What about it? You've letters unanswered, appointments missed, the firm's partners keep calling. You can't do everything alone." "I've managed so far," he said flatly. Margaret hesitated. She had served the Whitmores for over 30 years, had watched Edward grow from a bright young man to the weary figure before her now. She knew which subjects to tread carefully and which needed to be said, no matter the cost. "You've managed to survive, sir," she said softly. That's not the same as living. His jaw tightened. I don't need a lecture. Margaret. I know. She stepped closer, her small frame dwarfed by the vast study. But you do need help. A secretary. Someone to keep things in order. It's not about business, it's about letting someone else carry a little of the weight. He faced her then, eyes sharp. I don't want a stranger in this house. It won't be a stranger for long, she said, unless you insist on keeping it that way. For a moment, he almost smiled almost. And where would you even find such a person I already have? She replied, surprising him. Her name's Clara Dawson, comes with strong references, smart, capable. I spoke with her myself this morning. You took it upon yourself to— Yes, Margaret interrupted, a rare spark in her tone. Because I'm tired of watching this house rot from the inside out. Eleanor wouldn't want that, and you know it. The mention of his wife's name was like striking glass. Edward froze, every muscle tightening. The silence between them swelled until even the waves outside seemed to pause. Finally, he said, leave it, Margaret. But she didn't move. You can dismiss me if you must, sir, but you can't dismiss what's happening here. You need someone to help you. You need light in this place again. Then she turned, quietly leaving the study. The scent of lemon polish lingered in her wake. Edward remained standing by the window, staring at the gray ocean until the sun dipped below the edge of the world. The room darkened, shadows pooling like ink around his feet. He poured himself another whiskey. The liquid caught the firelight amber, like the color of Eleanor's hair in the summer sun. He thought about Margaret's words, about the stranger she had already chosen, a secretary, another person asking questions, moving things, changing things. He wanted to slam the door on the idea, but exhaustion pressed heavier than anger. The house was too big, too empty, and he was so very tired of his own company. When the phone rang, its sharp sound cut through the quiet like a blade. He hesitated before answering. Mr. Whitmore. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, with the faintest trace of warmth. This is Clara Dawson. Mrs. Hill said you might be expecting my call. Edward closed his eyes, exhaled through his nose. Expecting was generous. Yes, he said finally, his tone neutral. Mrs. Hill mentioned you. I'll arrive tomorrow morning, she continued, unfazed. 9 o'clock. Is that convenient? He almost said no. The words were right there, waiting. But for reasons he couldn't explain, perhaps fatigue, perhaps fate, he said instead, that will be fine. There was a brief pause. Then her voice softened, just slightly. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I look forward to meeting you. The line clicked. Silence returned. Edward set the phone down and stared at it for a long time, the weight of the decision settling over him like the coming fog. Outside, the ocean roared against the rocks. Inside, the great house of Windmere Cliff stood still, waiting as if it, too, sensed that something was about to change. Morning came to Windmere Cliff, wrapped in a thin silver fog, the kind that blurs the horizon and makes the sea and sky indistinguishable. Margaret Hill had already been up for hours, lighting the fireplaces, opening windows that hadn't seen daylight in months. She moved quietly, humming under her breath, though her eyes flicked often toward the clock. At precisely 9 o'clock, the faint sound of tires on gravel echoed up the long drive. A modest sedan appeared through the mist, its headlights cutting soft tunnels through the air. Edward Whitmore stood at the top of the main staircase, watching from the shadow of the landing. He hadn't meant to, but something had drawn him there, curiosity perhaps, or the simple pull of movement in a house that had known only stillness. The car door opened. A woman stepped out. She wasn't what he expected. Clara Dawson was younger than he'd imagined, maybe 30 or 31, with chestnut hair swept into a neat bun and a few loose strands brushing her cheeks. Her clothes were simple navy slacks, cream blouse, no jewelry, but a silver watch professional without pretense. She paused at the bottom of the steps, taking in the grandeur of the mansion and the wild Atlantic beyond it. There was no fear in her face, only calm observation, like someone assessing a challenge she intended to meet. Margaret opened the door before Clara could knock. "Miss Dawson, welcome to Windmere Cliff. I'm Margaret Hill." Clara smiled, extending her hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Hill. It's even more beautiful than I imagined." Margaret's eyes softened. "It was once—" "Come in, dear." Edward stayed where he was for a moment longer, listening to the murmur of their voices below. Then, straightening his shoulders, he descended the stairs. His polished shoes echoed sharply against the marble. Clara turned as he approached. For a moment, neither spoke. "Mr. Whitmore," she said finally, her tone respectful but steady. "Miss Dawson?" He gave a curt nod. "You're punctual. I try to be good. It's a quality I value." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Margaret glanced between them, recognizing the quiet clash of strong temperaments. Edward gestured toward his study. "Let's discuss your employment." Clara followed him through the long corridor lined with portraits, Whitmores of past generations staring down from gilt frames. Inside the study, she paused, noticing the towering shelves of books, the heavy curtains drawn halfway against the light, the faint smell of whiskey and old paper. He motioned for her to sit. She did, folding her hands neatly in her lap. He took his chair behind the desk, the same place he had spent countless hours surrounded by silence. "Mrs. Hill tells me you have experience as a personal assistant." "Yes, sir. Administrative work, scheduling, correspondence. I taught for several years before that." "Teaching?" "Yes," she said simply. "Literature?" Edward's brow lifted slightly. "Not exactly corporate experience." Clara's voice remained even. "Organizing people is universal, Mr. Whitmore. Children or executives, it's all about patience and clarity." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I don't require patience. I require precision. Then we'll get along fine." Something about her composure unsettled him. Most applicants had stumbled over their words, intimidated by the weight of his silence. But this woman, she sat calmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. He began scanning her resume, flipping pages with deliberate slowness. "Why did you leave your last position?" "Personal reasons." "Which are—" She hesitated, then said, "My employer passed away. It made me reconsider what I wanted next." His eyes flicked up. "I see." "Do you?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air, bold but not disrespectful. Edward felt the faintest twist in his chest. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, certainly not in his own house. He cleared his throat. "You understand this position involves discretion. My business dealings, my personal affairs, I understand confidentiality," she interrupted, still calm. "You'll find I don't pry." "Everyone says that," he murmured. "Until curiosity wins?" Clara tilted her head slightly. "Then you'll have to decide whether you want a secretary or a shadow." Edward blinked. "A shadow." "Yes, someone who disappears the moment you speak. I can be that, if that's what you want. But it won't help you." He set the papers down, irritation rising. "And what would you suggest?" "Miss Dawson." Her reply was soft, but it cut clean. "That you let me do what you hired me for, to organize your life, not to worship your ghost." The words landed like a blow. For a heartbeat. The room was utterly still. The old clock on the mantel ticked once, twice. Edward's hands tightened around the armrests. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Clara said, her eyes steady. "You've turned this place into a monument. I can respect grief, Mr. Whitmore, but I can't work inside a mausoleum. Then perhaps you shouldn't be here." "Perhaps," she agreed, rising from her chair. "But if you truly wanted to be left alone, you wouldn't have let me walk through that door." Her calm defiance startled him more than anger could have. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. searching for a retort that wouldn't sound hollow. Margaret, standing just outside the doorway, held her breath. She had seen this scene before, applicants shrinking under Edward's coldness, apologizing, excusing themselves, never to return. But this woman didn't shrink. She stood tall, quiet, unyielding. Edward finally spoke, voice low. "You're unusually direct for someone seeking employment?" "I'm not seeking approval," she replied. "Just a chance to do the job right?" Something flickered in his expression. Annoyance, curiosity, something between the two. "And what makes you think you can handle it?" Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I've lived through worse silences than this one." The air shifted. For the first time, Edward looked away. He rubbed a hand across his face, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You start tomorrow," he said quietly. Clara nodded once. "I'll be here at 8. As she turned to leave, Margaret stepped aside, watching her pass with an almost imperceptible smile. When Clara was gone, Edward remained seated, staring at the empty chair across from him. The house, for some reason, didn't feel quite as still. From the doorway, Margaret murmured to herself, barely above a whisper, "Maybe this one won't run away." Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the restless sea gray, endless, alive. By the second morning, the rhythm of Windmere Cliff began to change so subtly that even Edward didn't notice at first. When he walked into his study at 8 o'clock sharp, the curtains were already open. Light, thin as spun silk, streamed through the windows and laid warm patterns across his desk. The faint smell of coffee, not the bitter instant blend he always made himself, but something rich and dark lingered in the air. He frowned. On his desk sat a new calendar, each day neatly marked with appointments, meetings, and reminders written in Clara's careful hand. Next to it was a small vase of white lilies. "Margaret," he called, his tone edged. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sir, who put these here?" She glanced at the flowers. "Miss Dawson, I believe—" He sighed. "Tell her I prefer things as they were." "I'll tell her," Margaret said, though her voice betrayed the smallest smile. When Clara arrived, she carried a folder under her arm and an energy the house hadn't felt in years. "I noticed your correspondence was 6 months behind," she said briskly, settling at the smaller desk she'd claimed in the corner. "I've sorted your letters into categories urgent, pending, and irrelevant." Edward looked up from his blueprint sketches. "Irrelevant." She handed him a stack. Invitations, social events, charity galas. "You've been turning them down since 2020, for good reason?" "Perhaps," she said, already typing on her laptop. "But some of these are tied to your foundation. You could delegate attendance. I don't delegate socializing." She gave a small, amused sound. "You don't socialize at all." His head lifted sharply. "Is that part of your job description commentary?" "No," she replied without missing a keystroke. "But maybe it should be." He wanted to be angry. Instead, he found himself studying the way sunlight touched her hair, how she worked with quiet efficiency, never fidgeting, never filling the silence with nervous chatter. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't heavy or suffocating. It had texture breathing room. By the third day, the windows were open. Sea air swept through the house, carrying with it the cries of distant gulls and the rhythmic crash of waves below the cliff. Edward walked into the kitchen and stopped short. Clara stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, stirring something on the stove. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air. "I thought Mrs. Hill handled meals," he said. "She does," Clara replied, not turning around. "But she said you've been skipping lunch. That's my prerogative." "Not anymore. You hired me to keep order, remember?" She turned, offering him a taste from the wooden spoon, chicken soup, homemade. "It's good for people who forget they're human." He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, tasting it. The flavor was simple but comforting, rich broth, soft herbs, something warm that settled deep in his chest. "It's acceptable," he said, turning away too quickly. High praise, she murmured, smiling to herself. That evening, Edward found her again, this time in the dining room. 2 plates were set instead of 1. Candles flickered gently, though the sun hadn't fully set. I don't require company at dinner, he said. I know, Clara replied, sitting across from him. But the house seems to... He wanted to argue, but she was already ladling soup into bowls. They ate in silence. Yet it wasn't the old silence, the kind that swallowed sound and feeling alike. It was an easy quiet, filled with the small sounds of spoons, distant waves, and the faint ticking of the clock. For the first time in years, Edward didn't feel like he was dining inside an echo. Later, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Clara's voice from earlier drifted through his mind. It's good for people who forget they're human. He thought of Eleanor, how she used to tease him for being too structured, too disciplined. Even architects need chaos sometimes, she'd said. Now, here was Clara walking chaos disguised as composure. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, why does her presence make the silence feel different? Days became a quiet rhythm of rebellion. The house smelled of life again, coffee in the morning, flowers in the hall, the ocean breeze slipping through open doors. Clara's handwriting appeared on sticky notes around his desk reminders. Gentle instructions, sometimes just a single word like, breathe. Edward grumbled at first, but he followed them anyway. He began rising earlier. He walked the cliffs after breakfast, something he hadn't done since before Eleanor died. He noticed how the sea changed color with the hour gray in the morning, silver by noon, blue as dusk approached. Margaret noticed too. You've been eating more, she said one afternoon, her tone casual but her smile knowing. Am I being audited now? He replied dryly. Just observing, sir. It suits you. By the end of the week, Clara had rearranged his filing system, updated his project plans, and even convinced him to take a video call with an investor. He found himself performing better, sharper, like some dormant part of him had been reawakened. But with that clarity came discomfort. He began catching himself watching her, the way she frowned slightly when concentrating. The quiet laugh that escaped her when Margaret told an old story. It was dangerous. He knew. She worked for him. She was young. And yet, something in her steadiness called to him not romance, not yet, but recognition. A reminder of what still existed beneath the grief. It was near dusk when he realized the library door was ajar. Light spilled softly onto the hall carpet. He stepped closer, frowning. He hadn't allowed anyone into that room in years. Inside, Clara sat by the window, a leather-bound journal open on her lap. Eleanor's journal. Edward froze. The scent of jasmine still clung faintly to those pages. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. What are you doing? His voice came out sharper than he intended. Clara startled, closing the book at once. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hill mentioned these were part of the inventory. I didn't realize they were private. They're not inventory. They're my wife's. Her cheeks flushed. I understand that now. He crossed the room, snatching the journal from her hands. You had no right. I meant no harm. That's not the point, he snapped, louder than he'd spoken in months. You come into my home, move things, change things, and now you pry into my life. Clara stood, eyes steady, though her voice trembled faintly. You hired me to bring order, Mr. Whitmore. I can't do that if I don't understand the chaos you're hiding from. He glared at her, breathing hard. Get out of this room. She hesitated, then nodded once. Of course. As she walked out, the door clicked softly behind her. Edward stood in the middle of the room, the journal clutched against his chest. The smell of jasmine filled his lungs until it hurt to breathe. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of morning where even the sea seemed subdued, no waves crashing, only the low sigh of water against rock. Edward hadn't slept. He had spent the night pacing the library, the faint imprint of Clara's presence still clinging to the room. Her words echoed in his mind. I can't bring order if I don't understand the chaos you're hiding from. He told himself he was furious because of the intrusion, because she had touched something sacred. But beneath the anger, something deeper stirred. something dangerously close to understanding. He didn't like it. When he found her in the kitchen that morning, she was pouring coffee, calm, composed, as if nothing had happened. "Miss Dawson," he said sharply. She looked up, startled only by the volume, not by the tone. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." "There's nothing good about it," he replied. "We need to talk." She nodded, setting down the pot. "All right. In my study," he said. His voice clipped. Margaret, who was polishing silver nearby, froze mid-motion. She had lived through many of Edward's tempers, but there was something different in this one, quieter, more dangerous. Clara followed him down the hall without a word. Inside the study, he closed the door behind them with deliberate force. "You went through my wife's belongings," he said, "without permission." "I didn't go through them," Clara said calmly. The journals were on the desk. "I assumed they were part of the household records." "You assume wrong?" Her gaze stayed steady. "Then I apologize." "Apology doesn't undo disrespect." "No," she said softly, "but it can explain intention." Edward's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You have no idea what those journals mean to me." "I don't," she admitted. "But I know what they mean to you now, an anchor, something you keep clutching so you don't have to move forward. Don't presume to analyze me." "I'm not analyzing," she said. "I'm observing." His breath caught. "And what do you observe, Miss Dawson?" "That you're not living," she said simply. "You're surviving. You've built your life around the absence of her, as if grief were a form of devotion. But it isn't. It's self-punishment." He stared at her, stunned by her audacity. "You think you understand love." Her voice softened, but it didn't waver. "You keep her alive by punishing yourself. Mr. Whitmore, that's not love, that's fear." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stepped closer, eyes cold. "You have no right to speak of her that way." "I'm not speaking of her," Clara said, standing her ground. "I'm speaking of you." He wanted to shout, to dismiss her, to reclaim the authority that had just slipped through his fingers. His mouth opened, but nothing came out, because, deep down, part of him knew she was right. The truth in her voice was like a mirror held up to the life he'd been living, and he hated her for it. "Pack your things," he said at last, voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "You're finished here." Clara blinked, but her expression didn't break. "If that's what you truly want, I'll go. But before I do, answer one question." He frowned. "You're hardly in a position to ask questions." "Maybe not," she said quietly, "but I will anyway." Her eyes held his calm, piercing. "What do you think Eleanor would want for you, Mr. Whitmore? To keep this house locked in shadow forever, or to let it breathe again?" He turned away, jaw tightening. "You don't get to speak her name." "Then I'll stop," Clara said gently. "But she's already speaking through everything here, the light you refuse to let in, the garden you won't tend, the journals you won't read. She's asking you to live. You just can't bear to hear it." Edward felt the ground tilt beneath him. The room seemed smaller, the air thinner. "Get out," he whispered. Clara didn't argue. She gathered her notepad and pen, her steps slow but steady. When she reached the door, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said softly. "I don't think she'd want you to be alone." Then she was gone. Edward stood motionless, her words hanging in the air long after the door closed. Outside, a weak strip of sunlight pierced through the clouds, landing across the desk where Eleanor's journals still lay. The light touched the leather cover gently, almost like a hand. He sank into his chair and stared at it. His reflection shimmered faintly on the polished surface, older, harder, lonelier. "You keep her alive by punishing yourself." He wanted to deny it, but his mind betrayed him, pulling him backward to the last summer before she died. Flashback. The library had looked different then, filled with sunlight and laughter. The windows open, the scent of salt air mingling with the faint aroma of Eleanor's perfume. She stood by the window, turning slowly in a pale blue dress that moved like water when she laughed. "Do you ever stop working?" she teased, holding one of his blueprints upside down. "If I did, the world would collapse," he replied, mock serious. "Maybe it needs to collapse now and then," she said. "That's how new things grow." He had crossed the room and taken the paper from her hands, kissing her forehead. "You're impossible, and you love me for it." He smiled, then really smiled, and the sunlight caught in her hair. A bright golden halo. That was the last summer before the accident, the last time he'd let the light touch him. He blinked, and the memory dissolved, leaving him in the dim, quiet library. The same space, but emptier. The air was still thick with the ghost of her laughter. He rubbed his temples, fighting the ache in his chest. Clara's words came again, steady, uninvited, true. That's not love, that's fear. Maybe she was right. Maybe his devotion had become its own kind of prison. But if he stopped grieving, if he stopped holding on, what would remain of Eleanor? He looked at the journal again. For a moment, he imagined her standing there, not as the woman he lost, but as the one who had lived. Her voice was still somewhere in these walls, asking the same question she had asked that summer. "Do you ever stop working?" Edward's throat tightened. He whispered into the stillness, voice trembling. "I don't know how to stop missing you." The words fell softly into the air, and the house for once didn't echo them back. Days drifted by like tides, slow, uncertain, but moving nonetheless. After the confrontation in the study, the house held its breath. Clara continued her work in silence, professional and composed, never overstepping, never apologizing again. Edward, for his part, avoided her when he could, yet, somehow, her quiet persistence filled the empty spaces he thought would remain untouched forever. The air inside Windmere Cliff began to change. Curtains stayed open longer. Windows let in the sound of gulls and distant waves. The scent of coffee reached his study before he did, and the flowers those lilies she'd brought never disappeared. Whenever they wilted, a new vase appeared in their place. Edward told himself it was trivial. He told himself none of it mattered. But when he caught himself standing by the open window, breathing the morning air instead of his usual stale quiet, he couldn't quite convince himself anymore. It was Margaret who noticed first. "You've been less stormy lately," she said one afternoon, dusting the shelves in his study. "Stormy," he repeated, not looking up from his notes. She smiled. "You know what I mean. The air's lighter. The walls don't creak as much. Walls don't creak because of mood. Margaret." She tilted her head knowingly. "Don't they? Though?" He exhaled through his nose, but the corner of his mouth twitched a near smile. It was Clara's idea to restore the fountain. One morning, she appeared at his office door holding a rolled-up set of papers. "I found the original plans for the garden," she said, setting them on his desk. He raised an eyebrow. And the fountain is still structurally sound. It just needs a new pump, a bit of cleaning, maybe some plumbing work. That fountain hasn't run in years," he said, glancing out the window toward the overgrown garden. "There's no need to fix it." Her eyes softened. "Eleanor designed that garden, didn't she?" His chest tightened. "Yes. Then it deserves to live again. It was her joy. And maybe she hesitated. Maybe it could be yours again, too." Edward looked away. The idea scraped against the edges of his comfort. The garden had been Eleanor's world roses. Ivy. The sound of water, she said, reminded her of laughter. To see it again, alive and beautiful, felt almost like betrayal. Still, that afternoon, he found himself outside, standing beside Clara among the wild grass and crumbling stone. The fountain was worse than he remembered, dry, cracked, a nest of leaves and moss gathered in its basin. A carved angel stood in the center, her face streaked with years of rain and neglect. "Seems she's been waiting," Clara murmured. "For what? For someone to listen?" Edward crouched beside the base, brushing away a layer of dirt. The old marble gleamed faintly beneath. "The pump's gone. We'll need to replace the piping entirely." "I figured as much," Clara said, rolling up her sleeves. He blinked. "You intend to help." "I grew up fixing things with my father," she said. "If we're bringing it back, I want to be part of it." For the first time in months, maybe years, Edward laughed softly under his breath. "You're extraordinary, Miss Dawson." She smiled faintly. "I get that a lot." They worked for days. Mud, rain, stubborn bolts. The kind of manual work that leaves blisters and satisfaction alike. Margaret brought them lemonade and stood at the window, watching the impossible unfold. Edward Whitmore, the silent widower, on his knees in the dirt beside his secretary, sleeves rolled up, face smudged, alive. When Clara slipped on the wet stone and splashed into the empty basin, laughter erupted from both of them, sharp, surprised, unrestrained. The sound startled even the birds nesting in the eaves. Margaret, drying dishes in the kitchen, froze at the sound. It took her a moment to recognize it. Then she smiled, whispering to herself, "It's been years since I heard you laugh, sir." By the end of the week, the pump was installed, the basin scrubbed clean. Edward stood with his hand on the valve, hesitant. "Go on," Clara said softly. She'd want to hear it. He turned the handle. Water sputtered, gurgled, then burst upward in a clear arc before cascading down the angel's wings. The fountain sang again, the gentle sound of motion, of life returning. For a long while, they said nothing. The sun caught the spray and turned it into mist that shimmered like glass. Edward's throat tightened. "She used to sit right there," he murmured, pointing to the stone bench beneath the oak tree, with her sketchbook. Said she could hear stories in the water. Clara smiled. Maybe she was right. He looked at her then. Really looked, the sunlight brushing her hair, the steadiness in her expression, the way she seemed to listen to the world the same way Eleanor once had. A quiet warmth spread through him, frightening, fragile, real. He turned away before she could see it. That evening, as twilight settled, Edward stood at the window of his study. Outside, the garden shimmered under the last traces of light. The fountain flowed steadily, its sound mingling with the ocean breeze. Clara was still there, collecting her tools, her figure framed against the glow of the setting sun. She brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead and smiled to herself, the kind of small, unguarded smile that carried peace. Edward's heart stirred in a way it hadn't in years. It wasn't desire, not yet, but something gentler, like gratitude, like the ache of remembering how to live. He pressed a hand to the glass. The cold surface met his warmth, grounding him between past and present. For the first time since Eleanor's death, the silence around him felt soft instead of suffocating. He didn't realize he was smiling until he saw his own reflection in the window, faint, uncertain, but real, and somewhere behind him, faintly, he thought he heard the echo of Eleanor's voice, carried on the wind that slipped through the open door. Maybe it needs to collapse now and then. That's how new things grow. The fountain's murmur answered her. Edward closed his eyes and let it. The sound of a car engine echoed along the long, winding drive, a sound Windmere Cliff hadn't heard in months. It was late afternoon, and the sea outside shimmered in that pale, wintry light that turned everything silver. Edward looked up from the blueprint spread across his desk. Visitors were rare, almost extinct, and the few who still tried were usually turned away by Margaret before they ever reached the front steps. This time, however, Margaret's knock came sooner than expected. "Sir," she said, leaning in, a note of hesitation in her voice. "You have a visitor. I told you I know. But this one insists. He says you'll want to see him. Charles Benton." Edward froze. The name like a pebble dropped into still water. The ripples of old memories followed instantly. Charles Benton. Once his business partner. Once his friend. Once the man who'd toasted Eleanor at their wedding and laughed louder than anyone else. They hadn't spoken since the funeral. Edward straightened his cuffs. A habit from another life. Send him in. Charles Benton entered as if the years hadn't happened at all. He looked almost the same, tall, graceful, His gray hair swept back with careless confidence. His coat was expensive, his smile practiced, but his eyes held something different now, something that flickered between charm and guilt. "Edward," he said warmly, spreading his arms. "You look well. I can't say the same for your sense of timing," Edward replied. Charles laughed, unfazed. "You haven't changed, still the same sharp tongue, and you're still pretending not to hear the edge in it." Margaret lingered in the doorway, protective as always. "I'll bring tea," she said, though her tone suggested she'd rather bring armor. When she left, silence filled the room, interrupted only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Charles walked slowly around the study, glancing at the framed architectural sketches, the muted light filtering through the curtains. "So, this is what you've been hiding in." "I prefer living," Edward said. "Living." Charles turned, a hint of a smile on his lips. "If this is living, old friend, it looks an awful lot like waiting for something that'll never come." Edward's jaw tightened. "Say what you came to say." Charles hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "There's a project happening along the coast, restoration work, storm barriers, rebuilding the lighthouse at Point Haven. Eleanor loved that place, didn't she?" Edward said nothing. "I'm helping organize a charity gala to raise funds for it," Charles continued, placing the envelope on the desk. "I thought, maybe it's time you were part of something again. Time to open these doors." Edward's laugh was humorless. "You came all this way to invite me to a party. Not just any party," Charles said. "A cause that mattered to her. You used to talk about rebuilding the shoreline together. Remember?" The mention of Eleanor's name tightened the air in the room. Edward turned away, staring out the window at the restless ocean. "That was a long time ago. Some things shouldn't stay buried," Charles said softly. The words landed uncomfortably close to home. When Charles left, the house seemed smaller again. The smell of his cologne lingered faintly in the air, sharp and foreign. Edward sat at his desk, staring at the unopened envelope. He didn't want this. The thought of strangers in his home music, laughter, eyes watching him, pitying him, felt unbearable. But the other part, the part he never said aloud, was worse, a tiny flicker of longing for sound, for light, for something alive. He was still staring when Clara entered, carrying a stack of mail. "You have a guest," she said, noticing the extra cup on the tray, or had one. "Yes," Edward said curtly, "Charles Benton." Her brow lifted slightly. "Your former partner, former everything," he muttered. She placed the mail on the desk. "And what did he want to drag me into something I have no interest in?" "What sort of something?" Edward hesitated. "A charity gala, here, for coastal restoration." Clara's eyes brightened. "That sounds wonderful." He looked at her sharply. "Wonderful." "Yes," she said, "to bring people together again, to open the house." "I don't open this house." She didn't flinch. "Maybe it's time to—" Her tone was gentle, not challenging, yet it unsettled him all the same. Margaret appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on her apron. "She's right, sir," she said quietly. "This house could use some life again. We all could." Edward glared at them both, but neither woman looked away. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the chimney. "Finally," he said. "It's absurd. This place isn't meant for parties anymore." Clara stepped closer. "Then, what is it meant for dust?" He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. She turned, gathering her files, giving him time to answer. He didn't. As she reached the door, she said softly, "You can close yourself off from the world, Mr. Whitmore, but it won't stop the world from knocking." And then she left him with his silence. Later that evening, Edward sat by the fire, staring at the envelope Charles had left. The wax seal gleamed faintly in the firelight. He thought of Eleanor, her laugh, her endless energy for hosting, her talent for making strangers feel like family. Every spring she'd thrown a benefit for some cause close to her heart. The ocean, the schools, the art programs. She used to say, if a house can hold grief, it can also hold joy. It just needs permission. He took a long sip of whiskey. Permission. Was that what this was about? Outside, the fountain's soft trickle drifted through the open window, a sound he'd come to rely on. Life creeping back, piece by piece. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was time. He reached for the phone. Margaret, he said when she answered, call Mr. Benton. Tell him Windmere Cliff will host his damn gala. There was a pause, then a warm, almost relieved, yes, sir. When he hung up, Edward leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The weight in his chest felt a fraction lighter, though he wouldn't admit it out loud. The next morning, Clara stood in the empty ballroom, clipboard in hand. Sunlight poured through tall windows draped in dust-covered curtains. She brushed her fingers across the piano, leaving trails in the grime. The space was vast, filled with echoes and memories. It had once been the heart of the estate music, laughter, dancing. The ghost of it still lingered in the air. She imagined what it might look like again, chandeliers cleaned, floors polished, light spilling from open doors onto the garden, a place alive once more. Margaret appeared behind her, holding a feather duster. Brings back memories. Doesn't it? I've never seen it alive, Clara said softly. Margaret smiled. You will. Clara turned, looking around at the empty hall one last time. It deserves to be full again, she whispered. Outside, the fountain murmured its quiet approval. And somewhere in the distance, the sea broke against the cliffs, relentless, patient, alive. Windmere Cliff hadn't seen this much life in years. Trucks rolled up the drive carrying flowers, lighting equipment, crates of linens, and endless chatter. Laughter echoed from the hallways again, a sound Edward had almost forgotten belonged in houses. The once quiet estate buzzed with renewal. Gardeners trimmed ivy that had overtaken the stone walls. Electricians climbed ladders to rewire chandeliers dulled by dust and time. The scent of fresh paint mingled with salt air, while outside, the restored fountain sang ceaselessly, as if it too approved of the chaos. And in the middle of it all stood Clara Dawson, clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled up. She moved from room to room with brisk precision, delegating, answering questions, making decisions that Edward barely noticed he'd stopped making himself. The staff listened to her. Even the contractors took her word as final. She carried herself with calm authority, not as if she owned the place, but as if she cared for it. Edward found himself watching her more often than he wanted to admit. Mr. Whitmore, we'll need to move the tables nearer the windows for better light, she said one morning, looking up from a diagram. Do whatever you think best, he replied without thinking. She paused, amused. That's the third time you've said that today. You're letting me take over. Delegation, he said dryly, is a sign of leadership. It's also a sign of trust, she countered, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the noise of the workers faded around them, hammers, voices, the distant cry of gulls. It was just the two of them, standing in a sunlit corridor, and something unspoken passed between them, understanding, gratitude, the fragile warmth of connection. Edward looked away first. Don't get used to it. Clara smiled. Too late. Over the next few weeks, the house transformed. Edward's study, once cloaked in shadows, now smelled faintly of lemon oil and morning air. The ballroom gleamed again, its polished floors reflecting the light of chandeliers that sparkled like captured stars. Everywhere he turned, he saw her touch the subtle choices that brought harmony where there had been disarray. He caught her humming while arranging flowers in the dining room one afternoon. The tune was soft, familiar, though he couldn't place it. He stopped in the doorway, listening, watching how sunlight caught her hair. It wasn't just the house she was restoring, it was him, Margaret noticed. Of course. She always did. You're staring again, she said one evening, folding napkins beside him. I'm supervising, Edward replied. Too quickly, supervising what she teased, the way she breathes. He gave her a look, but she only chuckled. I'm glad, sir. It's good to see your eyes on something other than ghosts. He said nothing, but that night, he lingered by the fountain longer than usual, the water's rhythm matching the uncertain pulse in his chest. That night, Edward dreamed. He was standing in the ballroom, alone, but the air shimmered with light. Music drifted from somewhere unseen, a soft waltz he recognized instantly. The chandeliers glowed, and when he turned, Eleanor stood beneath them, radiant and laughing, her dress the color of morning. Eleanor, he whispered. She tilted her head. You look tired. Love, I'm trying, he said, his throat tight. I don't know if I'm doing any of it right. She smiled gently. You're allowed to live, Edward. He shook his head. It feels wrong. It isn't wrong, she said, stepping closer, her voice a whisper of memory. It's human. He reached for her, but she was already fading into the golden light. When he woke, his pillow was damp, and the echo of her voice lingered in the quiet. You're allowed to live. He sat up, pressing a trembling hand to his face. Morning light spilled through the curtains, and for the first time, he didn't close them. Later that day, Clara found him in the garden, sitting on the stone bench by the fountain. He was sketching something she hadn't seen him do before. She approached quietly. I didn't know you still drew. He looked up. I used to. Haven't touched a pencil since. He trailed off, glancing at the fountain. Since her, she finished softly. He nodded. I suppose I thought if I created something again, it would mean I'd stopped missing her, but maybe it just means I'm learning to carry her differently. Clara's eyes softened. That sounds like living. He gave a small, rueful smile. So, everyone keeps telling me. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of fresh-cut roses. Clara looked around the garden, the trimmed hedges, the soft hum of water, the faint trace of music drifting from an open window where workers tested the sound system. This place is coming alive again, she said. You should be proud. Edward set his sketchbook aside and looked at her. Really looked. You've done most of the work. She shook her head. No, Mr. Whitmore. You did. You just needed a reason. He studied her for a moment, searching for the right words. Gratitude, admiration, something more he couldn't name yet. The sunlight caught her eyes, and for a heartbeat, it was Eleanor's laughter all over again, not because they were the same, but because they were both light. He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his hands. Thank you, he said quietly. Then, after a pause, he added, Thank you, Clara. Her name on his lips felt strange, intimate, unpracticed, real. She blinked, a soft smile tugging at her mouth. You're welcome, Edward. The air between them shifted. Not romance, not yet, but something alive, something undeniable. Margaret watched from the window above, her hands resting on the sill, eyes shining. Below her, the two of them stood beside the fountain, the water catching the fading light like glass. Windmere Cliff had been silent for too long. Now, it breathed again. For the first time in almost a decade, Windmere Cliff glowed against the night sky. The great mansion, once a hollow monument to grief, now shimmered with life's strings of lights wound along the terrace railings. Candles flickered in the windows, and laughter drifted across the cliffs toward the sea. Music poured from the ballroom, a soft waltz that made even the walls seem to hum again. Edward stood at the top of the grand staircase, his reflection caught in the polished marble below. He wore his black tuxedo, the same one he had last worn the night before Eleanor's accident. Margaret had insisted on having it pressed and altered, and though it fit him perfectly, it felt like borrowed time. He exhaled slowly, the scent of roses from the garden mixed with champagne and candle wax. He could almost imagine Eleanor beside him, radiant, teasing, proud of him for opening the doors again. Sir, came Margaret's voice behind him. She looked at him with the fond scrutiny of someone who'd raised him as much as served him. You clean up well. Do I better than you think, she said with a grin. Now go on. People are waiting to see the man who brought Windmere back to life. I didn't bring it back, Edward murmured, glancing toward the ballroom. She did. Margaret followed his gaze and smiled knowingly. Then, maybe it's time you told her that. The ballroom was a vision. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, their light catching the restored parquet floor. Musicians played near the fireplace, their violins weaving through the murmur of conversation and laughter. Tables draped in linen bore the emblem of the Coastal Foundation. Eleanor's old cause, while the scent of sea lilies filled the air. And there, at the center of it all, was Clara. She wore a simple navy gown, understated but elegant, her hair swept up with a single silver pin. The color deepened the warmth of her skin, the light in her eyes. She moved easily through the crowd, greeting guests, directing servers, ensuring every candle, every glass, every note of the evening was in harmony. Several guests, unaware of her position, mistook her for the hostess. "Mrs. Whitmore, your home is breathtaking," one woman said warmly. Clara had flushed, gently correcting her. "I'm not Mrs. Whitmore," she replied. "Just someone lucky enough to work here." Edward overheard from across the room. Something in his chest tightened, a mix of pride, gratitude, and something deeper he couldn't yet name. He found himself watching her, how she laughed easily, how she moved through the space as if she belonged there, and perhaps she did. Charles Benton arrived fashionably late, as always. His smile was polished, his charm effortless. The crowd welcomed him with warmth, and he basked in it, shaking hands and trading stories as if he'd never left. When he spotted Edward across the room, he lifted a glass. "You've done it, old friend." "She would have been proud," Edward nodded. "You've managed to fill my house with strangers again." "Congratulations." "Strangers?" Charles chuckled. "Not for long. Look around you. Edward, this is what life is supposed to sound like." Edward didn't answer. His gaze had already wandered to where Clara stood near the musicians, speaking with one of the guests. The soft light of the chandeliers caught her in gold. Charles followed his eyes and smiled faintly. "Ah," he said under his breath. "So, that's how the wind has changed." Edward frowned. "Don't start." Charles raised his hands, merely observing. "She's quite remarkable. She's my employee." Charles's grin widened. "Of course she is." Then, without another word, he began to move toward her. Clara had just finished speaking with one of the donors when she turned to find Charles Benton standing before her, his expression warm and familiar. "Miss Dawson, isn't it?" he said smoothly. "Charles Benton." "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Clara smiled politely, offering her hand. "Mr. Benton, I've heard a great deal about you. Only good things. I hope that depends on who's telling them," she said, a spark of humor in her tone. Charles laughed, charmed, touché. His eyes swept over the ballroom. "You've done wonders here. It's as if the house itself has decided to wake up." "It wasn't just me," Clara said. "Mr. Whitmore had to open the doors first." "Yes," Charles replied, glancing toward Edward, who was standing near the fireplace, drink in hand, watching them both. "I can see he's done that. At last." The orchestra shifted into a lilting waltz. Charles turned back to her, offering his hand with practiced grace. "Would you honor me with a dance, Miss Dawson?" Clara hesitated just for a moment, her eyes flicking instinctively toward Edward across the room. Their gazes met, held. He should have looked away. He should have nodded, smiled, given permission. But he didn't. He simply stood there, frozen, his heart thudding with something fierce and unfamiliar. Clara saw the hesitation in his eyes, and then, gently, she placed her hand in Charles's. The crowd parted as they stepped onto the dance floor. Edward's chest burned as the music swelled. Charles was a good dancer, confident, effortless. Clara followed his lead with grace, her navy gown flowing like water. They spun beneath the chandeliers, laughter glinting in her eyes, light catching her face in ways that made Edward's breath falter. Margaret appeared beside him, her voice low. You're crushing that glass, sir. He glanced down. She was right. His fingers had tightened around the tumbler until the ice cracked. He loosened his grip and tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. She's free to dance with whomever she likes. Margaret gave him a knowing look. Of course she is. He turned back toward the floor. Charles said something that made Clara laugh again, a soft, unguarded sound, and Edward's jaw tightened. His pulse quickened, a hot flush rising under his collar. He told himself it was nothing. She was his secretary. She was doing her job. But the logic didn't hold. The longer he watched, the more that feeling twisted inside him, a mix of jealousy, guilt, and longing. Eleanor, he thought, what's happening to me across the room? Charles's hand lingered just a second too long on Clara's waist. That was when Edward looked away. He stepped out onto the terrace, the cool night air biting against his skin. The waves below crashed against the cliffs, relentless, indifferent. Behind him, the music continued, muffled through the glass doors, laughter, clinking glasses, the sound of life returning. Inside that brightness, Clara danced. Outside, Edward stood alone beneath the stars, realizing too late that the darkness no longer felt safe. The night air was sharp with salt and moonlight. Out on the terrace, the wind came in restless bursts, carrying the faint sounds of laughter from inside the ballroom. Edward leaned heavily against the stone railing, his knuckles white against the cold marble. Below, the waves struck the cliffs in rhythmic fury, as if echoing the storm inside his chest. He had thought himself past this past feeling anything so consuming, so foolish. Yet here he was, trembling with something he could barely name. How dare I feel this way? The question clawed at him, cruel and unrelenting. How can grief turn into desire? How can I want to live when she's still gone? He closed his eyes, trying to breathe through it, but every breath felt like betrayal. The image of Clara in Charles's arms laughing, glowing beneath the chandeliers, flashed before him again and again, searing itself into the quiet places of his mind. He had no right to feel this way. None at all. The sound of footsteps interrupted his spiraling thoughts. He didn't turn, still brooding alone. I see, came Charles Benton's voice, smooth, infuriatingly casual. Edward stiffened. Enjoying yourself? I hope immensely. Charles replied, You've outdone yourself. Edward, the house looks magnificent. And Miss Dawson, he gave a low whistle. She's quite the revelation. Edward's jaw clenched. She's an employee. Ah, Charles said, his tone laced with amusement. Of course she is. So were all the women you admired from a distance after Eleanor. That's enough. Charles ignored the warning. You've always had a weakness for women who make you feel alive. Eleanor did that too, didn't she? Made you forget the rest of the world. Until she didn't. Edward turned sharply, his face taut with restrained fury. You should leave. Come now, Charles said, stepping closer. Why so defensive? I'm simply observing. You seem taken with her. Edward's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you implying? Charles smiled faintly, a shadow of cruelty behind his charm. Only that grief can be a strange thing. It doesn't end. It changes shape. Sometimes it looks like love. Sometimes it looks like need. Don't presume to understand me. Oh, but I do, Charles said quietly. You've spent years punishing yourself for Eleanor's death. Everyone knows that. And now, when someone finally stirs the ashes, you mistake the warmth for forgiveness. The words sliced clean through him. Don't, Edward said, his voice trembling. But Charles went on. You think she'd approve. You think Eleanor would smile on you, falling for her replacement. Edward's breath caught, rage surging like the tide. Replacement? Charles shrugged. She cooks. She organizes your life. She brings the house back to life. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Edward's control shattered. Don't you dare, he hissed, stepping forward, voice low and dangerous. Don't you dare speak her name. Charles's smirk faltered, but only slightly. Edward, I said don't. The shout broke through the night, sharp and raw. It startled even Edward. For a moment, all he could hear was the sea, roaring below as if answering his anger. His chest heaved, his vision blurred with fury and guilt and something darker, shame. Charles took a half step back, his expression softening. You're still haunted, he said quietly. And she, Miss Dawson, she's just walking into the same storm. Edward's fists tightened. You know nothing about her. I know enough, Charles said. She's kind and curious. You'll destroy her without meaning to, the same way you destroyed Eleanor. The last sentence hit like a physical blow. Edward's breath left him in a single, shuddering exhale. For a long, unbearable moment, neither man moved. The music from inside floated faintly through the open doors, a slow, elegant waltz, cruel in its serenity. Finally, Edward spoke, voice low, shaking. You're not worth this conversation. He turned and started toward the far end of the terrace. Edward, but he didn't look back. He pushed through the glass doors leading to the side corridor, his footsteps echoing down the marble hall. The laughter from the ballroom felt distant now, foreign, belonging to another world. Inside him, something had cracked open, an old wound bleeding through the fragile skin of recovery. You'll destroy her without meaning to. The words wouldn't leave him. He reached his study and gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady his breath. His reflection stared back from the darkened window, haunted, aging, desperate. Don't you dare speak her name, he whispered again, as if saying it could undo the shame. But it was too late. He had spoken loud enough for the world to hear. Outside, Clara stood near the open terrace doors, the glow from the ballroom spilling over her shoulders. She hadn't meant to follow them, but something in Edward's sudden exit had pulled her forward. She had arrived just in time to hear the last of it, his voice raised, his face contorted with anguish. Charles standing before him with that infuriating calm. She hadn't heard the whole exchange, only fragments. Eleanor's name, replacement, and Edward's fury, raw and unguarded. Now she stood frozen, heart hammering, the music behind her clashing with the silence ahead. Margaret appeared at her side, eyes full of worry. Miss Dawson. Clara shook her head slowly, still staring toward the terrace where Edward had vanished. He's not all right? No, Margaret said softly. He hasn't been for a very long time. Clara's throat tightened, but he was trying. I thought he was finally. Margaret laid a hand on her arm. Grief doesn't disappear, dear. It fights back when it feels threatened. Clara swallowed hard, blinking away the sting behind her eyes. Through the glass doors, she could see Charles re-entering the ballroom, his charm perfectly restored, as though nothing had happened. But Edward was gone, swallowed by the dark halls of Windmere Cliff. He didn't stop until he reached the library. The room was dim, lit only by the dying glow of a single lamp. He sank into the leather chair where Eleanor used to read, pressing his palms to his eyes. The echoes of his own shouting replayed in his mind. He had promised himself never to lose control again, never to let rage and jealousy twist his love into something ugly. And yet, tonight, he had done exactly that. The sound of the sea outside grew louder, filling the silence like a reprimand. You're still haunted. He had thought the fountain, the laughter, the light, all of it meant he was healing. But now he saw how fragile that healing really was. He bowed his head, his voice breaking the stillness in a hoarse whisper. Eleanor, I'm sorry. The ballroom had begun to fade into quiet, guests departing in pairs, their laughter dwindling down the drive. Only the faint hum of the orchestra's final notes lingered, mingling with the sigh of the sea. Clara slipped out through the side doors and stepped onto the terrace, where moonlight brushed the stones, silver. The night was colder now, the air sharp with salt and wind. The garden below shimmered faintly, the fountain's steady murmur rising through the silence. She saw him there, half hidden in shadow near the railing, his posture rigid, his shoulders bowed under invisible weight. Edward, she called softly. He didn't turn. I shouldn't have danced with him, she said quietly, her voice barely reaching over the wind. If that's what this is about, then I'm sorry. Still, no reply, only the sound of the ocean below, relentless and unkind. She stepped closer, wrapping her arms against the chill. I didn't mean to hurt you. His voice came at last, rough, hollow. You didn't? She hesitated. Then why do you look like you're standing at a grave? At that, he finally turned. His face was pale under the moonlight, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, with shame. Because that's what this place is, he said quietly. A grave I built myself. Clara took another step, her pulse quickening. Edward, he shook his head, his breath unsteady. You saw what happened tonight, the anger, the jealousy. You shouldn't have. No one should have. I saw a man in pain, she said softly. That's all. He laughed once, bitterly. Pain is too small a word for it. Clara studied him, her voice steady. Then tell me what it really is. For a long time, he said nothing. The wind tangled through his hair, carrying the smell of the sea and rain. Then, with a tremor in his voice, he said, You deserve to know. Especially after tonight. She waited. He leaned against the railing, staring out into the black expanse of water. Eleanor and I, we argued the day she died. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to take the boat out. He continued, his tone detached at first, like someone reading a report of his own life. We used to sail every weekend in the summer. It was her favorite thing, the only time she truly seemed free. But that day, we fought. He swallowed hard. I had canceled our plans. Some meaningless business meeting I thought couldn't wait. She was furious, said I cared more about work than her. And maybe she was right. The wind rose, carrying the low roar of waves crashing far below. She said she'd go without me. I told her not to. The storm warnings were already out, but she was stubborn. She said she'd be back before dark. His voice cracked. She never came back. Clara's heart clenched. They found the boat the next morning, washed up near the rocks. The hull was splintered, the sail torn to ribbons. They said it must have capsized in the storm. He bowed his head, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles whitened. And I wasn't there. I should have been with her. If I'd gone, maybe I could have saved her. Or at least, his voice broke entirely. At least she wouldn't have been alone. Clara moved closer, but he didn't see her. His eyes were on the ocean, fixed and hollow. She died angry with me, he whispered. Her last words were in anger. I've lived with that every day since. The rawness of his confession tore at her chest. He turned then, finally meeting her gaze. That's why I can't, his voice faltered. Why I can't move on. Every time I feel something that isn't grief, I hear her voice again. I see the storm. I see that empty sea. And I think how dare I smile when she's gone. Tears blurred Clara's vision. She wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. He went on, his voice trembling like glass about to break. I thought rebuilding this house, restoring the garden, maybe that would be enough. Maybe I could bury the guilt under fresh paint and new light. But it doesn't fade. It never fades. The silence that followed was unbearable. The waves below crashed again and again, as if the ocean itself were answering his confession. Then Clara reached out, her voice a whisper. You didn't kill her. Edward! He shook his head violently. I may as well have. If I hadn't. No, she interrupted gently but firmly. You didn't kill her by living. You loved her. You argued. You were human. People fight, and sometimes fate doesn't give them the chance to say sorry. He closed his eyes, pain etching every line of his face. You honor her, she said softly. Not by drowning with her, but by forgiving yourself enough to live. He turned to her, startled by the quiet certainty in her tone. Her eyes, bright with tears, didn't waver. Eleanor loved life. Clara continued. She wouldn't want to be remembered through your suffering. You don't carry her by refusing happiness. You carry her by letting yourself feel it again. For a moment, Edward just stared at her, his breath uneven, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Then, slowly, he shook his head, voice breaking. I don't know how. The words came out like a confession and a plea all at once. Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could feel her warmth against the chill of the sea wind. Then let someone teach you, she whispered, one day at a time. They stood there, motionless, the night pressing close around them, two souls caught between grief and the possibility of something like grace. The fountain below continued its gentle song, the same rhythm Eleanor had once loved. It mingled now with the sound of the ocean, the wind, and Edward's uneven breathing. For the first time in years, the terrace at Windmere Cliff held more than sorrow. It held the fragile beginning of healing. And though neither of them spoke again, the silence between them felt different, not heavy, not hollow, but alive. The dawn after the gala arrived gray and restless. A thin mist clung to the cliffs, and the ocean below was a dull, heaving slate. The echoes of music and laughter had long vanished, leaving only the tired hush that follows revelation. Edward had barely slept. He'd spent most of the night sitting by the cold fireplace in his study, staring at the embers as if they could tell him what came next. His confession to Clara still rang in his ears, the storm, the guilt, the words he hadn't said to Eleanor. But beneath the ache, something else had begun to stir the faint, unfamiliar sense that he'd finally stopped lying to himself. For the first time in years, he had spoken the whole truth, or so he thought. A knock shattered the stillness. It wasn't Margaret's soft rap, nor Clara's careful tap. This one was heavier, urgent. Mr. Whitmore came, Margaret's uneasy voice. You have a visitor. Edward frowned. At this hour. Before she could answer, another voice drifted from behind her, familiar, low, threaded with regret. Edward. Charles Benton stood in the doorway. He looked nothing like the charming man from the night before. His tuxedo was gone, replaced by a crumpled gray coat. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, his confident posture replaced by something brittle. His eyes, always bright with calculation, were now hollow. Edward rose slowly from his chair. You have nerve, Charles. I thought I made myself clear last night. I know, Charles said, and you had every right, but I couldn't leave things the way they are. There's something you need to know? I've had enough of your insights, Edward said coldly. Whatever you came to say, it's about Eleanor. Charles interrupted. The name struck the air like lightning. Edward's expression darkened. You've said enough about her. I haven't, Charles said, voice trembling. Not nearly enough. Not for what I've done. Something in his tone, low, uneven, unguarded, made Edward hesitate. He exchanged a wary glance with Margaret, who lingered in the hall, her face drawn with concern. Charles took a deep breath, as if bracing against his own confession. You told me last night that Eleanor went out on the boat alone, that the storm caught her by chance. Edward's jaw tightened. Yes. Charles swallowed hard. She wasn't alone by accident. Silence fell. Edward blinked. What are you talking about? I was the one who asked her to go. Charles said quietly. I called her that night, told her I needed to see her urgently. The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Edward's face went still, the color draining from it. You what? I told her I had something important to tell her. Charles continued, his voice cracking, that it couldn't wait until morning. Edward's fists curled at his sides. You called her out in a storm? I didn't know it would be that bad, Charles said desperately. The reports weren't clear then, and what Edward's voice rose, sharp as glass. What could possibly have been so important that you risked her life? Charles's lips parted, his breath shallow. I wanted to tell her the truth, he whispered, that I loved her. The room went utterly silent. Edward stared at him, disbelieving, horrified. "You would I'd been in love with her for years," Charles said, the words tumbling out now, raw and unstoppable. "Before she married you, I thought I'd buried it, but I hadn't. That night, when I heard about your argument, I thought—" His voice broke. "I thought maybe it was my chance. I wanted to tell her, to ask her to leave you." Edward's entire body went rigid. His voice was no longer raised, just low, dangerous, trembling with fury. "You called her out there, to steal her from me." Charles's eyes glistened. "I didn't mean for her to go alone. I begged her to wait, but she said she'd meet me at the harbor. I was late. By the time I arrived, the storm had come in." Edward's breath hitched. "I saw her boat already leaving the dock," Charles said, choking on the words. "I shouted, but the wind, she couldn't hear me. And then, she was gone." The confession hit Edward like a wave breaking against rock. He staggered back a step, gripping the edge of his desk to steady himself. "So," he said hoarsely, "all these years, I've carried her death as my sin, and all along." Charles's face crumpled. "If I hadn't called her that night, she'd still be alive." Edward's eyes flared. "You filthy coward!" "Edward?" But, before Charles could finish, Edward lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar with both hands. Papers scattered from the desk as he slammed Charles against the wall. "You let me drown in guilt while you hid behind silence," Edward's voice thundered. "You let me believe I killed her." Charles's voice came out in gasps. "I thought you already hated me. I thought it would be easier to let me rot." Edward roared. "You let me bury myself alive while you danced at her grave." Edward Clara's voice cut through the chaos like a bell. She had been standing in the doorway, frozen until that moment. Now she rushed forward, her hands gripping Edward's arm. "Stop!" she pleaded. "He's not worth it." But Edward's rage was feral, years of silence cracking open all at once. His breath came fast. His hands trembled as he pressed Charles harder against the wall. Clara's voice softened, but did not waver. "If you hurt him, you'll never forgive yourself. You'll become the man you've spent years trying not to be." Her words pierced through the haze. Edward's grip faltered. His breathing slowed, each exhale ragged and unsteady. Slowly, he released Charles, stepping back as though the touch burned him. Charles straightened his collar, shame flickering across his face. "You have every right to hate me," he said quietly, "but I couldn't live another day with the lie. I needed you to know." Edward stared at him, his chest heaving. His voice came low, trembling with fury and restraint. "Get out," he said. Charles hesitated. "Edward." "I said get out," Edward snarled, "before I become the man I hate." For a moment, Charles seemed about to protest, then thought better of it. He nodded once, his eyes glistening, and walked out of the room. The door shut behind him with a final, echoing click. Edward stood motionless in the silence that followed, his breath ragged, his pulse pounding. Clara lingered near the doorway, her face pale, eyes filled with both pity and sorrow. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. He took everything. He whispered, "Eleanor, the truth, even my guilt." Clara stepped closer, her voice quiet. "He can't take what's left of your peace. Edward, don't give him that too." He closed his eyes, and for the first time, the tears came freely. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping through the garden where the fountain sang soft, steady, and unbroken. The house went still after Charles left, still in a way that felt unnatural, like the breath before a storm. Edward didn't remember sitting down. One moment he was standing, fists trembling, breath heaving. The next, he was in the old leather chair by the window, staring at the horizon as though the ocean itself had betrayed him. The morning fog hung heavy over the cliffs, swallowing the view. It suited his thoughts shapeless, gray, infinite. He had thought the worst was behind him. That confession, that night on the terrace with Clara, had felt like a door opening, but now another had slammed shut, and the sound of it echoed inside him. He had built his grief into something sacred, a monument to Eleanor's memory, to his own guilt. But with Charles's confession, even that had crumbled. The foundation of his suffering was a lie. He had been torturing himself for a crime he hadn't committed, and yet he still felt guilty. That was the cruelest part. For 2 days, Edward barely spoke. Clara stayed. She moved quietly through the halls, her footsteps soft against the polished floors. She didn't press him with questions or speeches. She simply was a steady presence against the emptiness threatening to swallow him again. She cooked meals he didn't eat. She opened curtains he never looked through. She lit fires in rooms he never entered. Windmere Cliff breathed only because she willed it to. Sometimes she would find him in the library, staring at nothing, the morning paper untouched beside his hand. Once, she caught him at the fountain, throwing stones into the water like a boy testing how far ripples could travel. When she asked if he was all right, he gave the same answer every time. I don't know. By the third morning, sunlight broke through the fog, soft, tentative, like a peace offering. Edward sat in his study, still in his rumpled clothes, staring at Eleanor's portrait. The gold frame glowed in the morning light, and her painted smile seemed almost alive. He felt hollow, as if the truth had emptied him of everything: anger, guilt, purpose. The door creaked open behind him. Clara stepped inside, holding a tray, coffee, toast, the smell of scrambled eggs and rosemary butter. She set it on his desk without a word. "I can't eat," he muttered. "Then don't," she said simply. "But it'll be here when you're ready." He watched her, his eyes weary. "Why are you still here?" "Clara." She looked at him then, really looked at the man unraveling before her, and the flicker of something human still burning in his eyes. "Because you need someone to remind you to keep breathing," she said softly. He looked away, his throat tight. "I don't deserve that." "No one deserves grace." "Edward," she said, "that's why it's grace." Her words settled over the room like sunlight quiet, warming the cold corners of his soul. He rubbed a hand over his face. "I don't even know where to start. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about her, about myself, it's gone. How do you rebuild a life that was built on ghosts?" Clara's answer came without hesitation. "Brick by brick," she said, "or in your case, heartbeat by heartbeat." He exhaled shakily, and for the first time in days, something close to a smile touched his lips. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," she said gently. "But it's possible." That afternoon, Margaret found him in the library, notebook open before him. He was writing the first real movement of will she'd seen since the confrontation. "What's that, sir?" she asked softly. "My resignation letter," he said. She frowned. "From what, exactly?" "From hiding," he replied. He glanced up at her. "I've been speaking to ghosts for too long. Maybe it's time I spoke to someone living." She blinked back a sudden tear. "You mean—" "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm going to see a therapist. Someone who knows how to deal with this." Margaret smiled faintly. "That sounds like the best decision you've made in years." "I'm tired of circling the same memories," he murmured, "tired of being both prisoner and warden." He paused, then looked toward the window, where the sunlight danced across the glass. "I can't change what happened, but maybe I can stop letting it define everything else." When Clara found him later, he was in the garden, the same bench where he'd once sketched the fountain. The roses, revived from neglect, were beginning to bloom pale pink and white against the dark green leaves. She hesitated at first, watching him from a distance. His posture was different now, still solemn, but not defeated. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it seemed lighter. He turned slightly, sensing her presence. "I spoke with Dr. Graham," he said quietly. "He'll see me twice a week." Clara nodded, relief softening her features. "That's good. I don't know what I'll say." "Then start with the truth," she said. "It's all you've ever needed." He smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I know the truth anymore." "Then find it," she said simply. piece by piece. The silence that followed was peaceful. Birds chattered somewhere near the hedges. The fountain trickled steadily, and the wind carried the faint scent of salt and roses. Edward stood, brushing the dust from his hands. The morning light touched his face, soft and golden. He closed his eyes and let it warm him. For years, he had lived in shadow, afraid of what light might expose. But standing there now, he realized the light didn't erase the past. It simply revealed what was still alive beneath it. He turned to Clara, his voice quiet but certain. "Thank you. For staying." She smiled. "You would have done the same." He shook his head gently. "I'm not so sure. That's why you need people like me," she said with a small laugh. "To remind you you're better than you think." He looked at her for a long moment, at the steadiness in her gaze, the compassion that asked for nothing in return. Then he nodded, and for the first time in years, Edward Whitmore walked toward the sun. Spring arrived slowly on Windmere Cliff, not with sudden warmth, but with small, patient signs. The roses in the garden pushed tentative buds toward the light. The fountain sang again, its clear water sparkling in the sun. And inside the great stone house that had once felt like a tomb, the sound of life began to hum quietly once more. Edward Whitmore rose early these days. He made coffee strong, black, always 2 cups, one for himself, one for Clara, who appeared precisely at 8 with her notebook and her calm, unhurried grace. They worked in companionable silence most mornings. She typed letters for the newly reopened Whitmore and Associates, the architecture firm he had abandoned after Eleanor's death. He handled calls again, his voice still a little rusty but steady, decisive. Sometimes, she caught him sketching in the margins of old plans, lines of imagination returning like muscle memory. He no longer flinched when the phone rang. He no longer avoided mirrors. And every Tuesday and Friday, he left the house promptly at 10 for his appointments with Dr. Graham. At first, those sessions were excruciating, full of long silences and sharp truths. But Edward faced them. For the first time, he allowed himself to speak aloud the things he had once buried: the storm, the guilt, the jealousy, even the flicker of something new he didn't dare call hope. Dr. Graham never told him what to feel. He simply listened, sometimes asking, "And what would Eleanor say to you now over time?" Edward stopped answering with sorrow. One afternoon, Clara was typing in the study when she noticed the faint hum of music, a vinyl record playing somewhere upstairs. She followed the sound to the music room, a space untouched since the gala. Edward stood by the window, sleeves rolled up, sorting through old sheet music. The turntable spun slowly, playing one of Eleanor's favorites, a soft jazz piece that filled the air with warmth instead of grief. When he saw Clara, he smiled an easy, genuine smile she had not seen before. "Trying to remember how this thing works," he said, gesturing to the player. "It's working just fine," she said, surprised by how natural it felt to say it. He chuckled, lowering the volume. "You know, I used to think healing meant forgetting. Turns out it just means remembering differently." She met his eyes. "That's beautifully said." He shrugged lightly. "Therapist's influence, I suppose." The song faded, leaving behind a silence that was neither heavy nor awkward, just real. The days blurred into a kind of rhythm work, meals, the quiet joy of small things done together. Clara oversaw repairs on the western wing, arguing kindly but firmly with contractors who underestimated her. Edward designed again, sketching with the same precision that had once built cities. In the evenings, they often walked the garden paths. The restored fountain now glowed under soft lights, the water casting rippling reflections across their faces. Sometimes they talked about trivial things, the stubborn ivy on the walls, Margaret's obsession with lemon cake, the unpredictable Atlantic wind. Other times, they talked about deeper things. "Do you ever miss who you were before?" Clara asked once. Edward thought for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I miss who I might have been if I hadn't stopped living." She nodded, understanding. There were moments, brief, fragile when their hands brushed as they walked, and neither pulled away. Moments when silence between them felt like a conversation, full of things unspoken but deeply understood. She never crossed the line between care and affection, neither did he. But something gentle had begun to take root, not passion born of impulse, but tenderness built on trust. It was in the way she brought him coffee just how he liked it, without asking. In the way he checked the locks each night because he knew she stayed late working. Two wounded souls rebuilding their lives, side by side. On a cool evening near the end of April, Edward knocked on the door of Clara's small office. She looked up from her typewriter, startled, something wrong with the payroll letters. He smiled faintly. "No, for once everything's in order. I just wanted to give you something." He held out a small, leather-bound sketchbook. The cover was worn smooth from years of use, the corners soft and faded. She hesitated before taking it. "It's beautiful," she murmured, running her fingers along the edge. "Is it yours?" "It was Eleanor's," he said softly. Her eyes flicked up, uncertain. "Edward, I can't." "You can," he said, "because it shouldn't sit on a shelf collecting dust." She used to sketch everything: flowers, boats, faces. She believed drawing helped her see the world more clearly. "I think she'd want someone else to use it now." Clara opened the cover. On the first page, faint pencil marks formed an unfinished sketch, a rose in early bloom. She traced it lightly, as though touching a memory. "She had a good hand," she said quietly. He nodded. "So do you." She blinked in surprise. "I haven't drawn in years." "Then maybe it's time you started again." She looked down at the sketchbook, then back at him. "Why are you giving this to me?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because you reminded me how to dream," he said simply. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled the curtains, carrying with it the scent of rain and ocean. Clara's throat tightened. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward smiled, a quiet warmth in his eyes. "You've done more for this house for me than you'll ever realize." He turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "Good night, Clara." She watched him go, the sketchbook cradled against her chest. When the door closed, she sat in silence for a long while before opening to the first blank page. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the pencil. Then, slowly, she began to draw the outline of a man standing in sunlight, his face turned toward the sea. The next morning, the sketchbook rested open on her desk when Edward passed by. He didn't comment. He only smiled, the kind of smile that held both gratitude and something unspoken, something alive. Outside, the fountain murmured, steady and clear. The roses had begun to bloom. Windmere Cliff no longer felt like a monument to grief. It felt like a place where life could grow again. 1 year later, Windmere Cliff shone like a dream reclaimed from ruin. The night of the second annual Coastal Charity Gala had arrived, and the great house glowed with a warmth that felt almost miraculous. Lanterns lined the driveway, their light flickering like fireflies. The gardens, once wild and neglected, bloomed in soft pastels, roses, hydrangeas, lilies their scent carried gently on the ocean wind. From the terrace to the ballroom, laughter flowed easily, echoing through rooms that had once been silent tombs. Edward stood near the entrance, adjusting the cuff of his tailored gray suit. He looked calm, composed, but more than that. He looked alive. It wasn't just the therapy, or the work, or the rebuilt estate. It was something in his eyes and ease that had been missing for too long. The weight that had once bent his shoulders was gone, replaced by quiet confidence. Beside him stood Clara, radiant in a flowing gown of soft emerald green. Her hair was pinned loosely, a few tendrils brushing her cheeks. She didn't wear jewelry she didn't need to. Her presence was enough. Guests greeted them together, not as master and employee, but as partners in the truest sense. "Mr. Whitmore," an investor said, warmly, shaking his hand. "The transformation of this place is astonishing. A year ago, I'd have sworn it was lost." Edward smiled, glancing toward Clara. "I had help," he said simply. The guest turned to her. "You've done wonders, Miss Dawson." Clara's eyes sparkled. "It wasn't just me. The house wanted to live again." The man laughed, assuming it was a metaphor, but Edward knew she meant every word. As the night unfolded, the ballroom filled with music and motion. The chandeliers above cast halos of golden light over polished floors, and waiters wove through the crowd with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. It was a far cry from the first gala, that tense, haunted night, when grief had still clung to every wall, when jealousy and ghosts had shared the dance floor. Tonight, there was only warmth, only life. Margaret stood near the buffet table, her hands clasped proudly as she surveyed the scene. She caught Edward's eye across the room and nodded a silent acknowledgement of how far he'd come. He returned the gesture, his expression soft. Clara moved through the guests with natural grace, checking on the musicians, laughing with the volunteers, making sure every detail fell into place. She seemed born for this, the pulse of life, at the center of a once broken world. When she reached the edge of the dance floor, she paused, looking up at the chandeliers. For a fleeting moment, the memory of that first gala flickered through her mind, the tension, the jealousy, the look on Edward's face when she'd danced with Charles. How far they had both come since that night. "Clara." She turned at the sound of her name. Edward stood a few steps away, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He offered her one, his smile gentle. "You've outdone yourself," he said. "We both did," she replied. He looked around the room at the light, the laughter, the ease. "I almost don't recognize it." She followed his gaze. "That's the point, isn't it? To make something new without erasing what was—" He studied her, the music swelling softly around them. "You always know how to say exactly what I need to hear." "Therapist's influence," she teased. He chuckled. "Maybe." They shared a quiet moment of laughter, and the world seemed to still for a breath. Then, from the corner of the room, the orchestra began to play a familiar waltz, slow, tender, timeless. Edward's hand tightened around his glass. "I know this piece." "You should," Clara said softly. It was Eleanor's favorite. The memory rippled through him, not painful this time, but bittersweet, tender. The music no longer carried grief. It carried gratitude. He turned to her, his voice barely above the sound of the violins. "Clara, may I have this dance for a moment?" She didn't move. Her lips parted in surprise, eyes flickering with uncertainty. But when she met his gaze, what she saw there wasn't longing or confusion, it was peace. She set her glass down, her hand slipping into his. "You may." They stepped onto the dance floor together. The crowd parted instinctively, conversations quieting as the two of them began to move. Edward's hand rested lightly at her back, hers at his shoulder. Their steps were slow, unhurried, not a performance, but a conversation made of movement. Around them, laughter continued, music rose and fell, and the chandeliers shimmered like constellations. But inside their small circle of light, time seemed to slow. Edward didn't think of Charles, or the storm, or the guilt that had once consumed him. He thought only of the woman before him, the warmth of her hand, the rhythm of her breath, the steady heartbeat that reminded him he was still alive. Clara's eyes lifted to meet his. "You've learned," she said softly. "To dance," he asked with a faint smile. "To live." He laughed quietly, not the hollow sound of a man pretending, but the genuine laughter of someone who had found his way back to himself. They turned in slow circles, the waltz carrying them gently across the floor. The same ballroom that had once witnessed his breaking now bore witness to his rebirth. At the edge of the room, Margaret stood beside the fountain of flowers near the staircase. Her hands folded over her apron, her eyes glistened as she watched them. Charles Benton's name was never spoken again in the house, but the shadow he had left had finally faded. Only light remained. She leaned toward one of the servers beside her and said softly, "Eleanor would be proud." The young man smiled politely, not quite understanding, but Margaret did. She could almost hear Eleanor's laughter faint, joyful, carried by the music, and she knew, in her bones, that peace had finally found this place. The waltz drew to its close. Edward and Clara stood still in the center of the floor, the last note lingering in the air like a held breath. Applause rose around them, warm and genuine. Clara blushed, but Edward only bowed slightly, his hand still holding hers. As the crowd dispersed back into conversation and movement, he leaned close enough for her to hear. "Thank you," he murmured, "for what she asked, for showing me that love doesn't die. It just changes shape." Her eyes softened. "You did that yourself." "Edward," he smiled, his voice low. "Maybe, but you reminded me it was possible." The orchestra began another song, livelier this time. They stepped aside to let others dance. From the terrace beyond the open doors, the sound of the sea rose calm, steady, eternal. The same sea that had taken Eleanor now shimmered beneath the moon, not as an enemy, but as witness. Windmere Cliff, once a monument to grief, had become a home again. And in the heart of its ballroom, under chandeliers blazing with light, Edward Whitmore and Clara Dawson stood side by side, not yet lovers, not yet bound by anything more than understanding, but whole. And that was enough. The storm had come and gone in the night. By morning, Windmere Cliff was wrapped in mist again, the air cool and fragrant after the rain. Edward sat in the library, the soft ticking of the mantel clock filling the quiet. He had meant only to sort through some of Eleanor's old things, the last of the boxes Margaret had kept stored in the attic. The task had waited years, but now it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like closure. The jewelry box was small, carved from dark wood, its hinges slightly tarnished. He remembered giving it to Eleanor for her birthday. She had filled it with letters and small keepsakes, pieces of her life folded into memory. As he lifted the lid, a faint scent of lavender drifted out, the one she'd always worn. Inside were strands of pearls, a silver locket, and beneath them, an envelope sealed in wax. His name was written across the front in her familiar looping script, Edward. His breath caught. For a long time, he couldn't move. Then, with trembling fingers, he broke the seal. The paper was delicate, yellowed around the edges. He unfolded it carefully. Her handwriting flowed easily, as though she had written it without effort, without fear. "My dearest Edward, if you are reading this, it means life has taken one of its unpredictable turns. I don't know when or how, but I know you and I know that whatever happens, you will try to carry it all alone. Please don't. You have a gift for building things, houses, bridges, dreams, but you were never meant to live inside ruins. If you ever find yourself surrounded by them, remember this: even broken places can bloom again. And if, someday, you learn to smile again, truly smile, don't look back in guilt. Look forward with love, because love is not something that ends. It changes, it expands, it finds new forms, new hearts, new mornings. You are allowed to live, always." Eleanor Edward's vision blurred as he reached the final line. The paper shook in his hands. For years, he had imagined what she might have said to him if she'd had the chance: anger, forgiveness, sorrow. But this was grace. He pressed the letter to his chest and bowed his head. The tears came quietly, not like the storms of old, but like gentle rain cleansing, not drowning. When he finally looked up, the morning light had brightened the room, turning the air golden, and for the first time since the accident, he whispered her name, not in mourning, but in gratitude. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said softly. Later that afternoon, the sky turned gray again, a light drizzle beginning to fall. Clara found him in the garden, standing near the fountain with the letter folded neatly in his coat pocket. She approached slowly. "You disappeared after breakfast. Margaret was worried you'd gone wandering into the storm." He smiled faintly. "Not this time. Just visiting old memories." She tilted her head, reading the emotion in his face. "You found something." He nodded, pulling the letter from his pocket. "She left this for me. I think she knew I'd need it one day. May I?" He handed it to her, and she read in silence. When she reached the final line, her eyes filled with tears. She returned it gently. "She sounds like she loved you very much." "She did," he said quietly, "and I her. But she also knew something I didn't, that love doesn't stay in one place. It moves forward, if you let it." They stood together in the soft rain, the fountain rippling beside them, the air filled with the scent of wet roses. "Clara," he said suddenly, his voice low but certain. She turned toward him. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket again, this time pulling out a small velvet box. It was simple, unadorned, yet it seemed to hold the weight of everything unsaid between them. Her breath caught. "Edward." He opened it slowly. Inside was a ring, not new, but beautiful in its simplicity. The band gleamed softly in the dim light. He looked at her, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've loved 2 women in one lifetime," he said. "One taught me how to live. The other taught me how to begin again." Her eyes shimmered, rain mixing with tears. "Edward, I don't know what the future holds," he continued. "I only know I don't want to face it without you." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Only the soft rhythm of the rain filled the space between them. Then Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said. Edward exhaled, relief and wonder crossing his face. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand shaking slightly. The rain fell harder now, not a downpour, but a steady, cleansing drizzle that soaked into the earth, darkening the soil around their feet. Clara laughed softly, tilting her face upward toward the sky. "It's like the world's giving us its blessing." He smiled, pulling her close. Then, "Let's not waste it." They stood there beneath the rain, arms wrapped around each other, the sound of the fountain mingling with the soft patter of water on leaves. The world around them felt reborn, every drop a benediction, every breath a promise. From the window above, Margaret watched silently, her hand pressed against the glass. She had seen grief hollow out the man she served, and she had seen love fill him again, not to replace what was lost, but to honor it. "About time," she whispered, smiling through her tears. When the rain began to fade, Edward and Clara lingered in the garden, soaked but unbothered. He turned to her, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "She said something in the letter," he murmured. "That love changes shape. I think she was right." Clara smiled through her tears. "Then let's see what shape ours becomes." The clouds parted slightly, revealing a sliver of light breaking through soft gold spilling over the garden, the fountain, and the 2 of them standing hand in hand. And as the last raindrops fell, Edward looked up at the sky, at the endless horizon Eleanor had once loved, and felt peace settle over him at last. A year had passed since the rain-soaked afternoon, when Edward slipped the ring onto Clara's hand. Now, Windmere Cliff was alive again, not merely restored, but transformed. The mansion, once cloaked in grief, stood radiant under the spring sun, its white stone walls catching the light like a beacon. Windows once shuttered in silence were now thrown open, letting in the sound of laughter, music, and the scent of roses carried in from the gardens below. Edward Whitmore had built empires before, but never something like this, something that breathed, something that felt like home. Guests filled the terrace that afternoon, glasses of champagne in hand, conversations mingling with the music of a small quartet playing near the fountain. The second anniversary of the Windmere Restoration Gala had drawn friends, colleagues, and even a few of Edward's former students. At the center of it all stood Edward and Clara, now Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, gracious hosts, partners, and quiet witnesses to their own miracle. Clara moved through the crowd with her familiar grace, greeting guests, laughing softly at jokes, her emerald dress swaying as she turned. The garden sunlight turned her hair gold at the edges, and when she looked toward Edward, Her smile was still the same one that had pulled him from the shadows years before, steady, kind, and full of life. Edward, for his part, no longer avoided people's eyes. He spoke easily, laughed often, and had even been known to tease his staff, a habit Margaret insisted was a sign of complete recovery. He had reopened his architecture firm months ago, but it was no longer driven by ambition. Instead, he had dedicated himself to mentoring young architects' dreamers who reminded him of who he once was. He taught them that buildings were not just walls and roofs, but vessels for the lives and memories that filled them. They must breathe, he told his apprentices one morning, just like the people who live inside. That philosophy had spread, and soon Windmere Cliff became a kind of sanctuary, not just a home, but a symbol of what could be rebuilt from ruin. Margaret, now semi-retired but as sharp as ever, supervised the kitchen like a benevolent queen. Even miracles, she'd say, need proper seasoning. She moved slower these days, but her laughter still rang through the halls. Whenever she passed the grand portrait of Eleanor now hanging in the music room, surrounded by flowers, she'd pause, nod, and whisper, "You'd approve, I think," and perhaps Eleanor did. For though her presence no longer haunted Windmere, it remained gentle, woven into the fabric of the house, into the scent of roses, into the sound of the sea. Her legacy had not vanished. It had simply changed form. As evening descended, lanterns flickered to life in the garden. The fountain glimmered in the twilight, the same soft music playing from a gramophone near the terrace steps. Edward and Clara slipped away from the guests and wandered toward the far end of the garden, where the roses climbed higher than ever before. The blooms were breathtaking crimson, ivory, and pale pink, each one tended with care and love. Edward had named the garden Eleanor's Walk. It was not a grave, not a shrine, but a celebration of beauty, of endurance, of love that refused to die. Clara bent to touch one of the blossoms, her fingers brushing its soft petals. "They're thriving," she said. "They are," Edward replied, his voice soft. "You'd think they know what they're named for." She looked up at him. "Maybe they do." He smiled, slipping his hand into hers. "It's strange," he said. "For so long, I thought grief was a kind of punishment. But now I see it differently." "How so?" she asked gently. He looked out over the garden, the lantern light catching his face in gold and shadow. "Grief isn't a prison," he said. "It's the price of love. And love." He paused, glancing at her. "Love is always worth paying again." Clara's eyes softened, shimmering with quiet emotion. "You always did know how to make a toast sound like scripture." He laughed, a deep, easy sound that rippled through the quiet. "Occupational hazard," he said. "Architects and poets both addicted to structure." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then build this moment. Edward, let's keep it." He kissed the top of her head. "We already are." The guests eventually drifted home. The music faded, and Windmere Cliff settled into the gentle hush of night. Inside, Clara placed fresh flowers beside Eleanor's portrait white roses this time and whispered, "Thank you." Edward found her there, and together they stood in silence, hand in hand. The moonlight pooled across the piano keys, soft and silver, and the fountain outside murmured its eternal song. After a while, they stepped out onto the terrace, where the ocean stretched endless and calm below. The same sea that had once taken so much now seemed to cradle the world instead, shimmering beneath the moon like a promise kept. Edward looked out over the horizon, his heart full but unburdened. He thought of the years behind him, the sorrow, the silence, the unexpected grace of a stranger who had become his home. And he thought of what lay ahead, not perfection, not certainty, but peace. He reached for Clara's hand. She took it without hesitation. The night air was cool, the scent of roses rich and alive. Edward exhaled slowly, a man no longer haunted, but humbled, reborn. And as the waves broke softly against the cliffs below, a voice not real, but remembered seemed to whisper through the wind. "You're allowed to live." He smiled, I am, he murmured, at last. Grief is not a prison. It's the price of love, and love is always worth paying again. A pause. Sometimes, the heart doesn't break once it breaks open. To let the light in, grief visits every heart that has ever dared to love deeply. But, as Edward Whitmore's story reminds us, loss is not the end of love. It's the proof of it. For years, he lived in the shadow of guilt, believing that pain was the only way to stay loyal to the one he lost. Yet true loyalty is not measured in suffering. It's found in the courage to keep living, to keep giving, and to open your heart once more. Life will break us in ways we never expect, but healing doesn't erase the scars. It teaches us to carry them with grace. Sometimes, the people who enter our lives unexpectedly, like Clara, are not meant to replace what we've lost, but to remind us of what still remains: kindness, purpose, and the quiet power of human connection. So, when the past feels too heavy, remember, this grief is not a prison, and love never truly leaves. It changes form, guiding us toward new beginnings. Each sunrise, each breath, each shared smile is life's way of saying, you're allowed to begin again. Because even after the hardest storms, the heart, if we let it, will always find the light. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, reminded you of someone you've loved, or simply gave you hope for new beginnings, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating stories that speak to the soul, stories about love, loss, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going. Stay with us for more tales that shine a little light into life's darker corners. Until next time, take care and keep your heart open to the next beautiful chapter.